Welcome to Inside Voices, a well-read magazine, Between the Pages podcast. I'm Robert Gwaltney, joined by my friend and co-host, Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And we're both super excited to enter into conversation today with award-winning author Federico Eribia. Welcome, Federico.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we're excited to have you here. And Federico, before we begin, I'm going to share a little bit about you with our listeners. So, Federico Eribia received the 2024 Lambda Literary Exceptional New Writer Award. His debut novel, Pedro and Daniel, follows two gay, neurodivergent Mexican-American brothers over a 24-year span who experience joy and laughter despite years of abuse and depression. Pedro and Daniel has won numerous awards, starred reviews, and other accolades, including Book of the Year by Kirkus Reviews and Bank Street. It was a finalist for the Ohioana Book Award and is longlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award. Federico is on the SCBWI Impact and Legacy Fund Steering Committee, the board of Read Your World, Inc., and is a state leader for Authors Against Book Bans. He's a member of various other writing groups. Federico is also a retired physician, woodworker, poet, and illustrator. He enjoys the intersections of his gay, neurodivergent, and Mexican-American identities. He and his husband live near Boston, Massachusetts. Jeffrey?
Thank you, Robert. And Federico, it's so good to see you again. So excited to talk about your beautiful book.
Likewise,
And
thank you.
it's so clear that it's a product of your heart and such a close relationship you had with your brother. I'm really curious, what do you think your brother would think of the story you created? And if you will, tell us a little bit about him. What was he like?
Sure. So I think I mentioned it in the book or somewhere that if Daniel read a draft of this novel, he would enjoy it and think it was great and hysterical. And then he would go nuclear with the edits and his red pen. He would be very supportive and then say, okay, let's make this better. And I think he would really love the final product. I honestly believe I brought him to life in the pages of the book. And I was at an event over the weekend, and the person who was interviewing me said, I immediately fell in love with the character Daniel. And that is what I wanted. I want people to fall in love with them. Pedro as well, but obviously this is a tribute to my brother. He was witty, sarcastic, just really loyal. And ultimately, I think one of his faults was that he was too trusting of people, which ultimately led to some of the worst situations he experienced when he left the home.
Well, thank you for sharing him with us.
Thank you.
So you write from different points of view, Federico, in Pedro and Daniel. Talk a little bit about that decision.
So there are 5 parts to the book. In part 1, it's a 16-month arc. So it's a monthly snapshot. And so, for you to understand, I might mention in August their annual trip to Mexico. In December, something to do with Christmas or La Virgen de Guadalupe or something like that. So because it's when they're 5 and 6 years old, it made sense for part 1 to be told in third-person perspective or narration. But as I was writing it, it felt like I was telling each story, each of those 16 stories, from a slightly different perspective. And ultimately, I realized that I was writing it as if it were either the family doctor, the priests, the police, the neighbors, the social workers who were aware of what was going on in the home, but chose not to intervene on the boy's behalf. So it's an interesting approach to telling a story, but I really like the way it worked out. It's almost like it's a novella within the beginning of the book. Then the rest of the book, parts 2 to 5, are told in first person, alternating between Pedro and Daniel. And each new chapter that the boys narrate, they're a year older. So the reader experiences their physical and emotional and psychological growth as they're changing and evolving. And I think it's one of the ways that the reader really understands each of the characters as they go on. You really, as a reader, you get into their head because there are a lot of scenes where they're just contemplating their lives, religion, a variety of other social issues. And it's important for the reader to really understand the two boys, because even though they were so similar, they were also so dissimilar.
Federico, you just mentioned, other characters influential character like the doctor, but I mean, your book it's unflinching. It looks at social isolation and physical abuse, and you really do hold people to account, but you do it with such painful topics, but you do it with such tenderness and such grace. How do you manage to write about such horrible events, difficult times, and do it so beautifully and tenderly?
So I guess I would start by saying that I'm an avid reader, and I know how I like to hear stories, especially stories where there are abuse. I'm the type of person that can't watch a movie if there's any abuse of children, women, or animals. I just won't watch. I mean, men as well, but I mean, just no abuse. I can't watch it. Even many wonderful award-winning movies, I can't watch them. So knowing that, I wanted to write this story and be honest about what was going on. And so I used a variety of different techniques. I used some nuance. There are some scenes where the reader experiences the boys dissociate as they're experiencing the abuse. And then I also use verse, which lends itself to playing with language and grammar and punctuation. So I just used a variety of different techniques that I've enjoyed as I read other books. And the last thing I guess I would say is that I kind of sandwiched a lot of the more difficult scenes between loving, humorous scenes where there's a lot of laughter.
Mm-hmm. So there was, a very difficult topic that you cover, and of course that's the AIDS crisis. Mm-hmm. I'm a teenager of the 80s. Was a young man in the 90s, so I remember it quite well. Talk a little bit about your thoughts about how our nation and politicians handled that crisis, and just any thoughts from a personal perspective and how you incorporated that into the book.
Yeah, so I will try to be succinct because I could talk about this for a long time. There is a lot that if you weren't around at the time, or even if you were, you may not have been aware of what was going on. So 1981 was important for a variety of reasons. In January of 1981, Ronald Reagan became president. In April of 1981, I had my first sexual encounter. And then in June of 1981, the first cases of HIV were identified. So I came out during that first 8-year period when Ronald Reagan was pretty much in charge of the country and, in many ways, the world and the response to this new pandemic. And I've done a lot of research about this because I want to make sure that I understand it correctly and that I voice it correctly. And like I said, there is so much to know, but I'll just give a couple points. Ronald Reagan did not mention HIV or AIDS until 4 years later, when he was asked a question at a press press conference. So if he had not been asked that question, he would not have answered it even for longer. He did not really speak out about it in a formal sense until 1987, 7 years, or I guess 6 years after the start of the pandemic. And in his speech, he never said the words gay or homosexual. I mean, given the times, he probably would not have said gay, he would have said homosexual, but he didn't even say that word. How can you give your first talk to the world, really, about this pandemic that's been going on for 6 years, decimating many aspects of societies all over the world, and not say those words? I could go on about Reagan for a while, but I would also say we need to remember that the Pope was also explicitly at fault for a lot of the problems that were happening at the time with regard to educating people about HIV. I mean, even just educating people about it, talking about how it's transmitted and how to avoid getting it. And to this day, condoms are not something that the Catholic Church allows or will condone, because it's considered part of contraception. This is now 40 years later, and the Catholic Church still won't say use a condom. That's just dereliction of duty in so many respects. The Catholic Church, and I would add to that in a separate component, just the Christian churches in general in the United States were also involved in silencing people about how to talk about HIV. They didn't want people to talk about safer sex. They wanted people to talk about abstinence only, waiting until you get married, heterosexual marriage, not really addressing the issues that were going on at the time. And so I address it somewhat in the book. I do want to make sure that people understand. I not only was coming out as a gay man, but I was starting medical school in 1984. And so I was learning with so much of the rest of the medical profession around the world about this new viral infection. And I remember feeling really hopeless that no one in authority, no one with any type of power could really affect change, because Reagan did not want to even say those words or go there. He surrounded himself with a lot of Christian conservative, I don't even know a nice word to say past that, but people like Phyllis Schlafly and Jesse Helms and Jerry Falwell, who really need to be remembered for their villainy. They really were the reason that people weren't educated, and ultimately, I believe that is why a lot of people got infected and ended up dying, when they might have been able to avoid it by having people really kind of step forward and say, look, let's talk about this. Let's make sure you're safe. So that's kind of like the general umbrella. Like I said, I could talk about this for a while, but there was a lot of fault with the people who had not only the ability to make change, but they also controlled funding. And without the funding, we couldn't get the research, we couldn't get treatments, and we couldn't get a cure. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
The brothers, the careers for the brothers are very important. One goes into clergy, one becomes a doctor. Because you went into medicine in 1984, what was the AIDS crisis, did it have any impact, and what impact did it have on you going into that line of work?
So pretty much like it says in the book, I mean, the book is a fictionalized retelling of my relationship with my brother, and ultimately, to some extent, our relationship with our parents. And, basically from the first chapters, it's very clear that the mother in the book thought that there were two professions that were the best, unequaled by any other professions, and it was being a doctor and being a priest. And I would have to say that that had to have played a role in my head. I know I was probably 6 when I decided I wanted to be a doctor. You kind of see stuff on TV, you kind of hear things in school, but when your mother repeatedly says, I would love to have a doctor and I would love to have a priest in my family, as in my children. I certainly did not want to be a priest, so a doctor made sense for me. And interestingly, I don't fully understand it because I don't really understand how a lot of people approach religion, but it's fascinating to me that my brother always wanted to be a priest, even after he was expelled from the seminary, from the college part of seminary, because he was gay.
Mhm. So your career as a writer, talk a little bit about how you made that transition, and is that something that you always felt you had within you to be a storyteller?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I have always been a storyteller. Since I was a kid, I always created stories for my younger siblings. We were left to fend for ourselves alone a lot. And I kind of assumed the role of parent very early. And so I just learned to tell stories. And in many respects, when I documented my patient visits, my coworkers would complain about this, but I would write stories about, when people came in, I would explain in a story why they came in and talk about their relationship or their pet or their family or their work. And I would go on for a few reasons. One, it really helped me remember the encounter. And I always went back and read what I wrote in the previous visit when they came back to see me, so that I had a kind of a refresher of what had happened the previous time. And I can tell you that every time that I brought something up from a previous encounter, the patient really appreciated it. So I've always kind of incorporated that kind of storytelling in everything I do. I retired from medicine 10 years ago. I had been slowly transitioning to woodworking, basically cabinet and furniture making. But when the pandemic hit, I decided that I didn't want to go into people's houses. And that's when I decided I would just stay in my house and write. It was the one thing that I knew I wanted to do that would keep me safe by myself in my office here. And I just really took to it very quickly. It took me a while to really understand the industry, which is a completely different story. But starting to write was something that really came naturally to me.
So I want to talk a little bit about the craft of writing. Pedro and Daniel, I think is stunning in its use of poetry and poetic proverb. And talk about your love of poetry and the role that in proverb plays within your work.
So another very interesting question. I primarily listen to audiobooks, partly because of some of my neurodivergent conditions that are autistic and dyslexic with some ADHD. So reading a book, as much as I'd love to open up a book and read it, I can get easily distracted. And it can take me a really long time to read a book. So I listen to audiobooks. And I'd been listening to many books over the last few years, not realizing that I was reading or listening to verse novels. Because if you don't see it, on the page with the white space and how the author decides to use, punctuations and grammar and things, you don't necessarily understand that that's what's happening on the page. You hear it, and to some extent, how the narration is done doesn't necessarily convey what's on the page. And obviously, I think I really enjoyed those types of books in terms of the messaging and the use of language. And I do think that it really kind of came out in the way I approached how I wrote these stories. And I would say that I clearly did not know what I was doing when I started this novel. I combined a variety of picture book manuscripts to become part one of the book, and then ended up writing the rest of the book kind of just as it kind of came out of my head. I use a program that allowed me to kind of move things around a lot. And I just really enjoy playing with language. I love using words that aren't usually commonly used, maybe some words that were more in vogue in the 70s or 80s. I do like when I read and when I write, I do want people to use their brain and to question. This is one of the reasons why when I use Spanish, I don't always translate. I do want people to kind of look at what I'm writing and what I'm saying and fill in the blanks sometimes. Or if it's a word that it's in English and it sounds interesting and they can kind of tell what I'm saying, I hope that they will go and look it up and maybe someday use the word. It's just something that it's part of the teacher in me.
And Federico, you mentioned, when you sort of started, it was more about the writing and less about the industry, but you have become such an active supporter, a really supportive member of the literary community. You highlight so many other authors, you create opportunities for them to showcase their work as well as your own. Will you tell us about some of your adventures in that area?
Sure. So I've always been a volunteer. I volunteered at the local hospital, I believe when I was maybe 12, in their physical therapy unit. And I've always enjoyed volunteering. I think to some extent at that time, it's because anything to get me out of the house. And especially if I could say it's because I want to be a doctor, I was allowed to do it. And it was a way to really meet new, interesting people. It was interesting to hear about the various injuries or accidents that they underwent that caused the need for physical therapy. And so slowly I just started really incorporating volunteerism at the nursing home. I've always volunteered throughout college and medical school. And so when I kind of jumped into the deep end in the publishing industry, I looked for ways to volunteer. And there are so many opportunities. There are so many great organizations that are dependent on volunteers. And gradually I started realizing that there are other ways to engage my friends and certainly other writers and illustrators who don't necessarily feel engaged. I found ways to kind of bring them into the fold and kind of make them feel like they're an important part of the community. And I just love doing that. I love paying everything forward. It's just part of my nature. And I've worked with SCBWI as an organization. I'm on the steering committee of the SCBWI Impact and Legacy Fund, which is a kind of like a satellite unit of SCBWI that handles funding for organizations. I created the School Librarians Mini Library Grant. So every quarter, 3 different school librarians get to choose $550 worth of books from a list that I created of marginalized or underrepresented either authors or protagonists. So, kind of just really finding ways to help people who are being affected in different ways. So this particular program helps marginalized creators getting into the hands of children. It helps the school librarians. It's just really kind of a win-win-win all around. And I've partnered recently with Bookalicious that helps me administer a lot of this. So they originally the grant was $500 and they added an additional $50, and they have helped me really kind of curate the list for the librarians to choose from.
Oh,
And,
cool.
I'm part of
I was going to ask if you could tell us, for those who don't know, what does SCBWI mean? What does it
Yeah,
stand
so
for?
SCBWI is the Society of Children's Books Writers and Illustrators. And at some point, I think that we want to add translators to the mix because they're an important part of the industry, and to some extent narrators as well. But it's a 50-year-old organization, so it's hard to change a name like that. But as much as possible, when I do talk to other organizations, I try to make sure that we're always including translators and narrators if it's appropriate for the conversation. And I'm on the Read Your World's board. I helped create their, I don't have it on me, a really great campaign that says LGBTQIA books save lives. And I created the graphic for it, and we put it on T-shirts and sweatshirts and stuff. And I am now also a state leader for the Authors Against Book Bans that is just 6 months old, and we're trying to really influence change in terms of how people see books and how people approach censorship and book bannings, and hoping to be able to uplift the authors that are affected, not just the ones that are clearly affected by a book ban, but also marginalized authors who have the crosshairs on them and on their books. They may not have been challenged yet, but they could be, just because it deals with a person of color or a queer person or any other combination of marginalization. So yeah, I really try to do as much as I can to make people aware, and then to kind of bring them in and have everyone kind of work together.
Federico, you're doing amazing writing and amazing work in the community. And we are coming to the end of our time together. But before we do have to say goodbye, what's next for you?
So the first thing on my list what should be first on my list is to get an agent. I never got an agent. I was able to submit this manuscript to my editor that, it was a picture book manuscript that eventually became Pedro and Daniel. So when he asked me to kind of combine all my stories into a novel, I spent pretty much 2 years writing it and revising it, and then another year really marketing it and promoting it as much as I can. At the same time, also writing other manuscripts. So I have several picture book manuscripts. I have a poetry collection, and I'm writing a graphic novel series and a young adult series. And I just recently started putting my toes out to look for an agent to help me kind of sell these books.
Well, I see an agent in your future clearly, and Jeffrey and I wish you every success with this novel and with all of your future work.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
So, gentle listeners, until next time, for Inside Voices, I'm Robert Gwaltney.
And I'm Jeffrey Dale Lofton. And remember to be creative, be courageous. Thank you.